Hello students, this is Dr. Hazarika, your instructor for labor economics this semester. And today I'm going to record chapter 1 of your textbook. I'd also make very brief comments about the syllabus, etc. Please download the syllabus from Blackboard, read it thoroughly. Please remember that you must purchase the required textbook, Labor Economics by George Borjas, or Borjas, right away. And without further ado, I'm going to launch into the chapter. Introduction to Labor Economics. Now, this is a very brief chapter, right? Just lays out some very introductory basic concepts. Why study labor economics? So a little bit of motivation here. And the first thing, of course, is that most of us will spend a large part of our lives in a labor market, right? And our involvement with the labor market will determine our lifetime earnings, our income, our wealth, how our children do in the future, etc., our status in society, etc., right? So that's one. So we have very personal involvement with labor markets. Second, many of the top policy concerns of our time, such as income inequality, immigration, trade policy, etc., all involve the labor market. For example, the immigration of low-skilled workers into our country can depress the wages of American low-skilled workers, right? And this can then exacerbate income inequality, correct? Just an example, right? So lots of policy issues closely entwined with labor markets, right? Third, by studying how labor markets work, labor economics will help us understand and address many of these social and economic problems facing modern societies, right? So this is a bit of motivation. And now let's talk about the three actors in labor markets, right? So there are three participants in labor markets. You have, of course, workers who supply labor, right? Without workers, there will be no labor market, right? And then you have firms or businesses who demand labor, right? Now, usually in a market for, let's say, milk or eggs, it's the firms who supply and it's the consumers who demand, right? But in this case, it's consumers/workers who supply labor. People supply their labor. And it's businesses who are on the demand side, right? So this is true of all factor markets, right? What is a factor market? A factor market is a market for resources, right? So the labor market is a factor market, and in factor markets, the role of the firm is that of demander, right? The firms demand labor. And the third actor in labor markets, of course, is the government. And this is true really of all markets, right? Consider the market for milk even, right? You have consumers, you have the producers of milk, and of course you have the government that pretty much lays out the ground rules, the rules of the market, the regulations, right? And so in the labor market as well, the government plays this role of regulating the market, right? Examples of regulation: minimum wages, right? The government sets a minimum wage, right? Laws about unemployment benefits, for instance. If you're out of work, how much assistance will you receive from the government? Well, that's something the government decides, right? Rules about occupational safety, right? The government requires that workplaces be sufficiently safe for workers. So these are all the types of regulations that the government is responsible for introducing, for setting, right? Let's look at the first of our actors, workers, right? So what motivates workers, right? What's the main motivation of workers? And the main motivation of workers is the desire to maximize their utility or satisfaction, correct? Now, this term utility is something that you would have learned in a Econ 2302, which is a prerequisite for this course, right? Principles of microeconomics, right? So the term utility should be familiar to you. So workers, meaning people, are motivated by the desire to maximize their satisfaction or utility. By doing what in this case? By dividing their time, right? There are 24 hours in a day, correct? But really after sleep, etc., we have perhaps 14 hours every day, which we then have to break up into work and leisure, right? So the worker's problem in this case is to maximize his satisfaction by optimally dividing his or her time between leisure and work, right? Now, the higher the wage, the more expensive it is for a worker to consume leisure. How's that? Because every hour of leisure involves giving up an hour of work and the wages that would have been earned in that hour of work, right? So there is this opportunity cost of consuming leisure, right? Now the term opportunity cost, of course, is something that should be familiar to you as well, right? So what is opportunity cost again? It is the value of opportunities given up. So in this case, by consuming an extra hour of leisure, the worker gives up an hour of wage, right? Gives up his hourly wage, in other words, right? So the higher the wage, the more expensive it is to consume leisure, because an hour of leisure is now more expensive in the sense of having a higher opportunity cost, correct? So a rise in the wage then tends to induce workers to consume less leisure, because the higher the wage, the more expensive is leisure, correct? So this tends to make for a positively sloped labor supply curve. So what would a labor supply curve look like? You would have the wage or the price of labor on the vertical axis. On the horizontal axis, we would have the quantity of labor, right? And workers' labor supply curve tends to be positively sloped, meaning that the higher the wage, the more expensive it is to consume leisure, and hence the worker consumes less leisure. By consuming less leisure, of course, the worker is supplying more hours to work, right? Because remember, the worker is dividing his available hours between work and leisure. So less leisure means more work, correct? So this makes for a positively sloped labor supply curve, a positive relationship between the wage and the quantity supplied of labor by a worker or workers, right? Of course, this is not strictly speaking true. A little later on in this course, we will talk about something called a backward bending labor supply curve. So there could be instances where a higher wage will cause workers to supply less labor. But this is something that we will discuss in the next chapter, right? Our next actor, of course, is firms, and firms decide how many workers to hire and also what types of workers to hire. For example, should a firm hire skilled workers or less skilled workers, right? Now, firms are motivated by the desire to maximize profits, just as the worker is motivated by the desire to maximize utility or satisfaction, right? Now, the lower the wage, the lower the price of labor, the greater is the firm's profit from hiring a worker. Now, what is this profit from hiring a worker? This profit is the difference between A, the revenue that the firm earns from selling the output of the worker. So let's say you're a baker, right? And you hire a worker, and this worker produces for you 50 loaves of bread. And you sell these 50 loaves of bread in the market for bread, and thereby derive some revenue, right? So this is the revenue that you earn from hiring that worker who produces these 50 loaves of bread. So that's the revenue from hiring the worker, right? But then also there is the cost of hiring the worker. You have to pay him a wage, him or her a wage. So what is your profit from hiring this worker? It's the difference between the revenue that the worker earns for you, the firm, minus the cost to you of the worker. That's the profit, correct? So hence, the lower the wage, the lower the cost of the worker, the higher, all else remaining the same, of course, assuming that the price of bread is unchanged, etc. The lower the wage you have to pay the worker, the greater the profit that you, the firm, earn by hiring him. So you'd have a greater incentive then to hire him and others like him, the lower the wage. You follow me? So the lower the wage, the higher the profit from hiring the marginal worker. And this makes for a negatively sloped demand curve for labor. So once again, here we have the wage, which is the price of labor, right? And here we have the quantity of labor measured along the horizontal axis. And this is the demand curve for labor, right? Because the lower the wage, the higher the profit that the firm can earn from hiring a worker. So the lower the wage, the greater this profit, and hence the greater the incentive to hire more workers on the part of the firm, right? Again, we will look at this in greater detail in, I believe, chapter 3. Chapter 3 deals with labor demand, right? Finally, the government, and as I mentioned, the government provides the ground rules that guide exchanges made in the labor market. Exchanges made in the labor market. What is the nature of this exchange in the labor market? The worker sells his labor and receives in return a wage. That's the exchange, right? And the ground rules are set by the government, right? What do these ground rules include? Price controls, the minimum wage, right? You may have learned about price controls in, again, principles of macroeconomics as well as principles of microeconomics. What's a price control? There are, as you probably recall, two types of price controls: price ceilings and price floors, right? A price floor is a price control that prevents the price from falling all the way down to its equilibrium level, right? So therefore, a price floor is always set above the equilibrium price, correct? So again, this is something we'll discuss in more detail in chapter, I believe, 4, labor market equilibrium. But if you think about a competitive labor market, you would have the wage, W, quantity of labor, L. You have a market demand curve for labor by firms. You have a market supply curve of labor by workers, right? So without any intervention in this market, the equilibrium wage would be where the two curves intersect. So this would be W star, the equilibrium wage. But what if the government comes in and says, well, that W star is too low to allow workers a decent living. So let's protect them a little by setting a minimum wage, a price floor, W min, set above W star. So by law, the wage may not fall below W min, right? So that is one example of a ground rule that the government sets, right? Price controls. The government may also set such things as labor quality controls. For example, the government may require that a doctor, who is a certain kind of skilled worker, right? The government may require that the doctor be board certified, right? Without this certification, it is illegal for a doctor to practice medicine, as you probably know, right? Now, why does the government require this type of board certification? It's to ensure that the quality of medical services produced is high, right? The quality of services produced is high. To ensure that, you have these labor quality controls that the government imposes, right? You also have workplace safety standards. For example, the banning of materials containing asbestos in construction. Asbestos, as you know, can cause lung cancer if inhaled, right? So the government has banned the use of this material in construction. This was not always banned. It's a fairly recent ban. So for many, many years, asbestos is widely used. Then the government observed that lots of workers, construction workers, were getting sick, right? And so this material has now been banned, right? So this is the role of the government. The government plays the role of regulation. Labor market equilibrium, as I just drew a diagram. You have here a labor demand curve, negatively sloped. We have a labor supply curve that's positively sloped. Who demands labor? Firms demand labor. Who supplies labor? Workers supply labor, right? And you have labor market equilibrium where the two curves intersect. And that gives us the equilibrium wage W star as well as the equilibrium quantity of labor, elsewhere, right? And the minimum wage here is a government regulation, a price floor, right? So this is a price floor in the labor market. Now, what's the role of economic theory in labor economics? We'll be going through quite a lot of dense theory in this course. So what's an economic theory? Again, this is something that you may have heard of already in perhaps Econ 2302, Principles of Microeconomics. So what's an economic theory or a model? A model is a simplified view, right? So this is a simplified view of an economic phenomenon, one that focuses on the essential variables while leaving out other less crucial factors. That says here, this simplification or abstraction is undertaken with a view to understanding the economic phenomena. Without this simplification, the phenomena may seem too complicated to understand. Right? So in other words, scientists, in order to study something, have to make all kinds of simplifying assumptions. What's the purpose of these simplifying assumptions? The purpose is to focus on the essentials, right? Because real life is highly complicated, right? You cannot view all the various influences in one go. You follow me? So if you're studying a certain phenomena, a certain cause and effect phenomena, you're going to focus on certain variables, leaving out others. That's the purpose of a theory then, right? So a theory then, or a model, is a simplification of reality. And what's the purpose of this simplification? The purpose is understanding, the understanding of the phenomena being studied, right? So we shall use consumer theory involving indifference curves and the budget line, right? Now again, this is stuff that you may have seen in Econ 2302, Principles of Microeconomics, right? So we'll be bringing this in, right? We shall use consumer theory to understand the workers' supply of labor. And we'll be using the theory of the firm involving the production function to understand firms' demand for labor, right? So we'll be using quite a lot of economic theory that you have already been introduced to in your two principles classes, right? But we'll be getting into some detail now, right? Next, positive versus normative economics. Again, this is something that you will certainly have seen in, say, principles of macro or even principles of micro. Positive versus normative. So what is positive economics? Positive economics is simply about what is. So the focus of positive economics is simply to describe what is, to understand what is, to address the facts, to answer questions using economic theory. So we're simply going to understand what is. That's positive economics, right? For example, positive economics, as is written here, positive economics can be used to demonstrate that while immigration hurts domestic workers, the gain to domestic firms more than outweighs the loss to domestic workers. Now, this is something that we will study in chapter 4 of the book, right? I'm just laying it out here, okay? So this is, for example, the one use of positive economics, to understand a phenomenon, right? So we can use positive economics, we can use economic theory to demonstrate that immigration benefits firms, hurts workers, and in dollar terms, the benefit to firms outweighs the loss to workers, correct? The focus of this course, the focus of really most economic courses, I would go so far as to say all economics courses, the focus is positive economics, right? Now, what is normative economics? Normative economics, on the other hand, is all about what should be, not what is, not to describe or understand what is, but to discuss what should be, what ought to be. And this requires value judgments, right? And because it requires value judgments, normative questions cannot be answered solely on the basis of theory or the facts. For example, consider the normative question, should the US allow immigration? Now, this is a normative question, right? Why? Now, just because positive economics tells us that the gain in dollar terms to domestic firms outweighs the loss to domestic workers, just because that is true. It may not be said that immigration is, on the whole, beneficial. Why can't we say that? Because after all, it's not possible to compare the loss to workers to the gain to firms. They're two different parties, right? Can you say that one person's joy outweighs the other person's suffering? It's impossible to make that kind of statement without bringing in value judgments, right? So if you're on the side of firms, you would say, well, immigration is great because the gain to firms outweighs the loss to workers in dollar terms. On the other hand, if you're more sort of left-leaning, let us say, if you're more concerned about workers like Senator Bernie Sanders, right, then you'd be more concerned about the loss to workers. You would say that that hurts more, that matters more than the gain to firms. My point is that in normative economics, you have to bring in value judgments. And this course should really skirt value judgments. We should avoid value judgments, right? The scientific approach really can't meddle with value judgments, right? Economics is supposed to be the social science, so really our focus has to be positive economics. And here's an application, a real world application. Now this deals with the Alaskan oil pipeline. Now I should mention a little bit of history here. In the year 1973, you had a war in the Middle East between Israel and a bunch of Arab countries. And of course, needless to say, the US came out on the side of Israel, supplied Israel with military equipment, etc. And this sort of ticked off the Arabs. And when that happened, the Arab countries decided to sell less oil to the United States. Because, as you know, a lot of the world's oil is in the Middle East, controlled by Arab nations. Right? So this caused a huge shortage of oil, energy shortage in the US, and there are photographs from that era. If you go and Google the 1973 oil crisis, a lot of photographs will involve cars lined up outside gas stations, long queues outside gas stations, because there isn't enough gas for everyone. Gas is rationed for a while, for instance. Right? So this event caused the US to become a little more concerned about its energy supplies, and there was a lot of oil in a very remote region of Alaska. And so this is when the US government decided that, well, they're going to go and exploit that oil. We have to be self-sufficient in oil, right? And so that oil began to be pumped out of the ground in remote Alaska. But then this oil had to be brought to the coast, the southern coast of Alaska, which is where the oil could be picked up by oil tankers and then brought to the mainland of the US for refining, for turning the oil into gasoline, etc. Right? So in order to bring the oil from the remote areas where it was being pumped out of the ground to the southern coast of Alaska where it can be picked up by the oil tankers, well, that transfer necessitated the construction of a pipeline, a gigantic pipeline. Right? And this Alaskan oil pipeline was built between the years 74 and 77. So between these 3 years, the pipeline was built. Now, if you look at this data here that's been nicely been graphed for us, the black line shows us the employment numbers in the state of Alaska. Right? So in the year 1968, there were fewer than 70,000 workers in Alaska. Right? And of course, you have these fluctuations, right? It goes up and down and moves around, but there is this upward trend. So this is the date when the oil pipeline began to be constructed, but you can see that even before that period, there was this upward trend in employment, and this was because, well, the state was developing and the population of the state was increasing, etc. So you had this long-term trend, but then come 1974, you see this bump up. Correct? So the trend is now broken and you have a much more rapid increase in the number of workers in Alaska, right? And this continues until this is 1977. And then the peak is reached, and then thereafter it drops off, and then it continues along the old trend. You see the old trend? It continues along the old trend. So here we have this bump up, and that's because these are the years in which the pipeline was being built. Correct? So that's the black graph. So let's look at the blue graph. Blue graph shows us the average monthly salary of Alaskan workers. So before the oil pipeline was built, the average salary was monthly salary was around here. So that would be around $2,500 a month. That's the average monthly salary in Alaska prior to the oil construction of the pipeline. But during the construction, you can see that salaries rise. You see this blue graph rising. And then once the pipeline is completed, salaries drop again to pretty much old levels, maybe slightly higher than the old level, but again, it flattens out. Correct? So this is something that the data tells us. Labor economics involves the statistical analysis of labor market data, right? And the data can be presented like this, in this form, in the form of graphs, right? So how do we understand what was happening here? Why was employment as well as the wage rising during the period 1974 to 1977? Well, we can use a simple demand-supply analysis to figure this out. So this is a diagram for the labor market. We have employment, which is the same thing as the quantity of labor, right? And you have earnings, or the wages, right, which translate to earnings. The price on the vertical axis, of course, the price of a worker is his wage, correct? You have a labor demand curve, and the original demand curve is D0. And this is the supply of workers, S0. Correct? So this was the old labor market equilibrium. That was the old wage pre-construction. This was the old equilibrium number of workers, the equilibrium employment, in other words, in Alaska. And then once the pipeline is being built, demand for labor increases. You have this. I don't like this arrow. This arrow really should have been like this. It's always a horizontal shift, correct? So I would cross that out like a horizontal shift, right? As you know, as you've learned in your principles courses, demand and supply curves moved left and right, not up and down, but left and right, correct? So we have a rightward shift in the demand for labor. In other words, you have an increase in labor demand, a rightward shift. And this rightward shift causes a new equilibrium to arise right there, correct? And this naturally causes the equilibrium wage to rise from W0 to W1, and also equilibrium employment to increase from E0 to E1. So this is what happened during the pipeline boom, right? But once the pipeline was constructed, once construction is finished, then the demand curve D1 moves back to the left. And this causes the wage to drop to its old level. Does that make sense? Sorry about that. All right, so this is how you would understand this phenomenon. So simple demand-supply analysis goes a long way to explain many economic phenomena, labor market phenomena. So in summary, labor economics studies the workings of labor markets, right? This is important for a variety of reasons that I've mentioned, including the fact that we ourselves, you and I, will spend the majority of our working lives in a labor market, right? The labor market contains three actors: workers who supply labor, firms who demand labor, and the government that regulates the labor market. Labor economics uses much economic theory. What's a theory? A theory is an abstraction from reality, a simplification of reality, with the aim of understanding economic phenomena. What's a good theory? A good theory should have realistic assumptions and should be testable against real-world data. That's the mark of a good theory, right? Labor economics uses a lot of economic theory, right? And this theory will help us to answer what kind of questions? Positive questions. What is? We will understand what is. And we will not spend a lot of time figuring out what ought to be, right? So normative questions are really not the focus of this course, right? Economic theory will help us answer positive questions, ones that do not involve value judgment. Where are we going? Well, in Chapter 2, we will study labor supply. Chapter 3, labor demand. Chapter 4 will give us labor market equilibrium, right? And then Chapter 6. In Chapter 6, we will study education. Chapter 6 is about education, and we will learn exactly the contribution of education to earnings. What's the schooling earning connection? Of course, this is something of probably great interest to you, because you are currently accumulating schooling. You're accumulating what's called human capital, which is a fancy phrase for skills. You know the meaning of the word capital, correct? What does capital mean? Capital in economics doesn't mean money. Capital means machines, right? So what's human capital? Human capital is the machinery that resides in our heads, inside us, the skills, in other words, that we possess, right? So chapter 6 will study the schooling earnings nexus, and this will go a long way to explaining why there is variation in earnings between people. Why do some people earn much more than others, right? So this will, in other words, explain something of income inequality. Differences in human capital go a long way to explain differences in people's earnings. In other words, explaining income inequality. All right, so that'll be chapter 6. In chapter 7, we will look at the wage distribution, or the distribution of earnings. So that is going to look at the wage distribution. So this will again be a detailed look at income inequality. In chapter 8, we will look at labor mobility, both within a country and across national borders. So this will deal a little bit with immigration, but also with American workers moving from one place to another. Right? Now, I know that many of you will, even after you graduate, choose to live here, right here in the Valley. In other words, my experience tells me that a lot of my students choose not to migrate northwards. Right? People are very attached to their families, etc., here in the Valley, as you well know. So you might say that our local labor is not very mobile, right? And there is a consequence. The consequence is that our workers here earn less than their counterparts in other parts of this country. Wages here are slightly depressed. And that's because workers here choose not to migrate to labor markets offering them a higher wage. So they sort of crowd up this local labor market, causing the supply of labor here to be quite high. And as you know, when the supply of labor increases, demand, supply. So when the supply of labor increases, which is a rightward shift of the supply curve, what happens to the equilibrium price or the equilibrium wage? It tends to fall. So low wages in our region can at least partly be attributed to the fact that our workers are not very mobile. And we'll talk about that in more detail in chapter 8. In chapter 9, we will look at labor market discrimination. Again, a very hot topic, as you probably know. And chapter 12 will deal with unemployment. Right? So this lays out our path to the future. And with that, I will end this lecture.